Imagine a summer day in Anaheim, when the mirrored sky of California reflected in the glass facades and glittering attractions. July 20th, 1994, would have been remembered as an ordinary day in the happiest place on Earth, had it not been for a disappearance that turned it into one of the darkest days in the park's history. Lumine and Lumei, 12-year-old twins of Chinese-American descent, vanished without a trace after their mother left them alone for 7 minutes to get frozen treats. Those 7 minutes stretched into 3 decades of searches, hopes, and despair. What no one knew at that moment was that these smiling girls in identical red dresses would become ghosts haunting Disneyland's collective memory. Their photograph with Mickey Mouse, taken just moments before their disappearance, became the last evidence of their existence in this world. Fate had a cruel plan in store for the Liu family when the mother returned with 2 vanilla ice cream cones to an empty bench. Wan Liu, a 40-year-old widow raising the twins after her husband's death in a car accident, never imagined that a simple trip to Disneyland would turn into a nightmare. That day, she had photographed her daughters with a person in a Mickey Mouse costume near Sleeping Beauty's castle. The sky was cloudless, and the air was filled with the scent of popcorn and cotton candy. If only she had noticed the nervousness of the employee in the costume, his strange silence, uncharacteristic of the park's entertainers. If only she hadn't left them alone. When Wan returned, her daughters had vanished, and so had Mickey Mouse. At first, she didn't panic, thinking that the twins had simply gone to the next attraction. But a mother's intuition was already ringing alarm bells. Lumine and Lumei never left without warning, never broke the rules. They were exemplary children, their mother's pride, straight-A students in school, and talented pianists. 15 minutes of fruitless searching passed before Wan raised the alarm. 10 minutes later, the entire park security was on high alert. Surveillance cameras were reviewed, visitors were questioned, and the area was scanned. By evening, the Anaheim police had joined the search, and Disneyland, for the first time in its history, faced a crisis of such magnitude. But the mountain of secrets remained silent. Security camera footage revealed a strange scene. Mickey Mouse, holding the twins' hands, was leading them away from the central square toward a service entrance. The girls didn't resist. They trusted the symbol of childhood, a character who embodied joy and safety. But beyond the service door, there were no cameras. There began a territory where park guests never ventured, and the twins' trail was lost in the labyrinth of service corridors. The police quickly determined that 3 employees had taken turns wearing the Mickey Mouse costume that day. 2 of them had impeccable alibis. The third, 22-year-old James Morton, didn't show up for his next shift and disappeared. His apartment was empty, his personal belongings were packed. It seemed he had vanished as suddenly as the twins. His photograph instantly appeared on all the country's television channels, but he was never caught. What no one knew then was that James Morton was a false name. The documents turned out to be high-quality forgeries, and the person hired at Disneyland had used the identity of a deceased teenager from Ohio. The true identity of the kidnapper remained a mystery that the police couldn't solve. The irony was unbearable. A company known for its thorough employee screening had hired a ghost. The first days of the search were the most intense. Police combed every corner of the park, every inch of the surrounding area. Helicopters with thermal imagers scanned the terrain. Divers explored the artificial lakes and ponds. Nothing. The twins had vanished as if they had never existed. The only proof of their presence in the park remained that last photograph with Mickey Mouse, where they were smiling, unaware of the impending darkness. In the girls' room at their home in San Francisco, everything remained untouched. 2 beds with identical bedspreads, 2 desks with neatly arranged textbooks, 2 violin cases. Wan sat between these beds, night after night, going through photo albums and remembering every moment of her daughters' lives. Their first steps, their first words, their first day at school. And now only silence and empty rooms. But fate hadn't finished its cruel game with the Liu family. 3 weeks after the twins' disappearance, when the search had already begun to subside, another blow struck. Wan Liu received an anonymous letter. In the envelope with no return address was a photograph. In it, the twins were sitting on the floor of an unfamiliar room, holding a recent newspaper with the date on it. They were alive, at least at the time the picture was taken. Under the photograph, a blurred inscription read, "They are safe. Do not look for them." At that moment, everything changed. The investigation, which had begun to fade, flared up with renewed vigor. The FBI joined the case, analyzing every pixel of the photograph in search of clues. Experts tried to determine the location by reflections in the windows, by the texture of the walls, by the angle of light. Newsstands were checked for witnesses who had seen an unusual customer. But the clues were too vague, too insignificant to lead to a specific location. 2 months later, a second letter arrived, another photograph, another newspaper with a new date. The girls looked exhausted. Their eyes had lost their sparkle. This time, the note read, "They are paying for their father's sins." This message turned the course of the investigation. Juan was stunned. What sins? Her husband, Jean Liu, had been a simple engineer who died in a car accident 3 years ago. He was a loving father, a devoted husband, an ordinary American of Chinese descent whose life was an open book. The FBI began to dig deeper. Jean Liu's story suddenly didn't seem so simple. Before moving to America, he had worked for a technology company in Shanghai, connected to the Chinese government. There were hints of industrial espionage, of technology theft, of a double life. Was Jin's death not an accident? Was the kidnapping of the girls an act of revenge? These questions haunted the investigators, but the answers slipped away like morning mist over the San Francisco Bay. A third letter arrived 6 months later, the last one. The photograph showed only the twins' red dresses, neatly folded on a bed, without the girls, without explanation, without hope. Experts found no traces of blood on the clothes, but the feeling of finality was unbearable. Juan Liu refused to believe the worst, but with each passing day, hope melted like ice under the California sun. Years passed, and the case of the Liu twins gradually became an unsolved, frozen story. Detectives replaced each other, new investigation methods replaced outdated ones, but there was no breakthrough. Juan Liu grew old waiting. Her hair turned gray, and her face became covered with premature wrinkles. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, she came to the gates of Disneyland with photographs of her daughters, silently standing for hours. Her quiet protest became a tradition that the park tolerated but tried to ignore. 10 years later, the first glimmer of hope appeared. In the Mexican city of Tijuana, a primary school teacher noticed 2 girls strikingly similar to what the Liu twins might look like as adults. They lived with a man who claimed to be their father and rarely went outside. Juan immediately flew to Mexico, accompanied by FBI agents. But by the time they arrived, the house was already empty. Neighbors spoke of a nighttime departure, of a car with tinted windows, of quiet girls who always walked in pairs and never smiled. The trail vanished again. 15 years after the disappearance, the case was officially suspended. Resources redirected to more recent cases, more promising investigations. Only Detective Raymond Clark, one of the first officers to arrive at Disneyland on the day of the disappearance, continued to work on the case in his spare time. Even after retiring, he didn't give up the search, gathering scraps of information, trying to piece together a puzzle with too many missing pieces. 20 years after the disappearance, another twist occurred. An anonymous source sent the police an old videotape. It contained an amateur film shot on the day of the twins' disappearance. In the background, almost imperceptibly, a person was seen leading 2 girls in red dresses toward the parking lot. His face was hidden under a hood, but experts were able to reconstruct a partial profile. And this profile didn't belong to James Morton. The kidnapper was someone else. Perhaps Morton was merely an accomplice, a diversion, but even this clue didn't lead to a breakthrough. Facial recognition technology, even the most advanced, couldn't identify the person from such a blurry image. The database of missing persons was filled with new cases, and the story of the Liu twins gradually turned into an urban legend, a scary tale that Disneyland employees told each other. Don't stray from your children. Don't trust costumed characters. Watch your loved ones. 25 years after the disappearance, Juan Liu died of cancer, never knowing what happened to her daughters. She was buried next to an empty symbolic grave for the twins in Calma Cemetery, south of San Francisco. Few people attended the funeral. A few neighbors, a couple of journalists still interested in the old case, and the elderly Detective Clark, who felt personally responsible for the unsolved crime. He placed 2 white roses on the grave, one for each of the missing girls, and vowed that he wouldn't stop until he found answers, even if there was no one left to tell them to. And then came the 30th anniversary of the disappearance, July of 2024. The world had changed beyond recognition. Disneyland had expanded. New attractions had replaced old ones. New generations of children laughed where 2 children had once disappeared. The story of the Liu twins was now remembered only on the anniversary, and even then, fleetingly. It had become part of the dark underbelly of the park's history, which the company preferred not to mention. At that moment, fate decided to reveal its cards. On April 22, 2024, a construction crew working on the expansion of the Anaheim light rail line discovered something terrible. While drilling a tunnel nearly 2 miles from the park, workers breached an abandoned drainage shaft, sealed off many years ago. Inside lay 2 small skeletons and a cracked plastic helmet in the shape of Mickey Mouse's head. In that moment, everything changed. The old case was once again in the spotlight. Detective Clark, now a 75-year-old man with trembling hands but still a sharp mind, was called to the scene. The smell of dampness and decay filled the abandoned shaft. A faint greenish light from the flashlights reflected in the puddles of stagnant water. Clark looked at the tiny bones and felt his heart clench with pain and relief at the same time. Finally, the Liu twins had been found. Forensic analysis confirmed the worst fears. The skeletons belonged to 2 girls of Asian descent, whose age at the time of death was around 12 years. Death had occurred from asphyxiation, probably within 24 hours of the disappearance. A DNA test comparing samples with Wan Lu's preserved cells left no doubt. These were Lumine and Lumei. They hadn't been taken out of the country, hadn't been held captive for years. Their lives had ended almost immediately after the kidnapping. But this discovery raised more questions than answers. Who kidnapped the girls? Why? What was the connection to their father? And, most importantly, how did the perpetrator manage to carry 2 bodies through the guarded territory of the park and bury them in the drainage system without attracting attention? The seemingly hopelessly outdated investigation received new impetus, and this time technology was on the side of justice. On the plastic Mickey Mouse helmet, despite decades spent underground, particles of DNA had been preserved. Modern methods made it possible to extract the genetic material and create a profile. This profile was uploaded to an international DNA database, where an unexpected match occurred. The DNA belonged to a man named Victor Jian, a 73-year-old retiree living in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon. When the police arrived at Jian's modest home, the old man didn't seem surprised. He had been waiting for this moment for almost 3 decades. Gray-haired and bent with age, he opened the door before the officers even knocked. "I knew you would come," he said calmly. "I'm ready to tell the whole truth." And the truth turned out to be more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Victor Jian was not a random criminal. He was a former colleague of Jean Liu's at the technology company in Shanghai. Together they worked on a secret project for the Chinese government, a surveillance system capable of recognizing faces in a crowd with incredible accuracy, a technology that was a decade ahead of its time. Jean stole this technology before fleeing to America, where he sold it to American corporations for millions of dollars. The money the Liu family had lived on all these years was tainted by betrayal. Jian was sent to retrieve the data and punish the traitor, but by the time he arrived in the United States, Jean Liu had already died in a car accident. It really was an accident, a cruel twist of fate. Victor watched the family for several years, planning the kidnapping of the children, not for ransom, but for revenge. Working at Disneyland was the perfect cover. He used forged documents to get hired there, studied all the service routes and exits, all the blind spots of the cameras. The plan was simple and cruel. Kidnap the twins, make their mother suffer from the unknown, and then kill the children as symbolic punishment for their father's sins. The letters with the photographs were part of the psychological torture. The girls were actually dead by the time the first letter was sent. The photographs had been taken in the first hours after the kidnapping, before he strangled them and hid their bodies in the drainage shaft, which he had learned about by studying old maps of the city's communications. Jian's confession was videotaped. His words sounded cold, without remorse. He spoke of justice, of betrayal, of duty to his homeland, but in his eyes, something else could be read, the weariness of a man who had lived for decades with the burden of his deeds. "I have fulfilled my duty," he said at the end of the interrogation. "Now I am ready to face my punishment." Victor Jian's arrest was broadcast live on all major news channels. The gray-haired old man in handcuffs, being led from his home, looked ordinary, almost harmless. It was hard to believe that this man had committed such a monstrous crime. But the evidence was irrefutable. The DNA on the helmet, the detailed confession, knowledge of details that only the perpetrator could know. Jian's trial was swift. Despite his age, the judge showed no leniency. 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each life taken. The cell in which the killer would spend the rest of his days was in the same prison where, 20 years earlier, another criminal had sat, claiming to have seen the twins alive in Mexico and demanding money from the desperate mother for information. Poetic justice in its darkest manifestation. The story of the Liu twins didn't remain just a tragedy. It led to significant changes in security policies, not only at Disneyland but also at all theme parks in the country. Biometric screening of employees working with children became mandatory, tracking systems were improved, blind spots were eliminated, laws on missing children were tightened, and the response time of security services was reduced to a minimum. In 2025, 31 years after the tragedy, a monument was erected on the spot where the bench from which the twins disappeared once stood. 2 bronze figures of girls holding hands, with the inscription, "In memory of Lumine and Lumei, may all children be safe." The opening ceremony was held in light rain, giving the moment a special solemnity. Among those present was Detective Clark, who had lived to see the resolution of the case of his life. The remains of the twins were reburied next to their mother in Kalma Cemetery. On their common gravestone are engraved the words, "Divided in life, reunited in eternity." Finally, the Liu family was together, albeit in such a tragic way. Hope may become ill, but it never dies completely. In this case, it transformed into memory and a lesson for future generations. The story of the Liu twins is now taught in police academies as an example of how even the coldest cases can be solved decades later. The photograph of the girls with Mickey Mouse, taken minutes before their disappearance, hangs in the FBI director's office as a reminder that time can be an ally of justice. Tragedy turned into a legend, legend into a warning, warning into a change for the better. 30 years of uncertainty ended with the truth, albeit a bitter one. The small skeletons found in the forgotten drainage shaft finally gained names and a story. The man who took their lives was punished. The system that allowed it to happen was reformed. And yet, the question remains, is that enough for redemption? Can justice that comes so late truly heal the wounds of the past? Once upon a time, 2 little girls came to the happiest place on earth and met their killer there. Their story reminds us of the fragility of happiness, of the dark side of human nature, of the fact that even in places created for joy, evil can lurk. But it also speaks of the power of justice, of the fact that even the darkest secrets ultimately come to light. The irony is that the facial recognition technology that essentially caused the twins' deaths ultimately helped to expose their killer. What was stolen by their father ultimately helped find the truth about their fate decades later. The circle was completed, albeit too late for those who might have found solace in knowing the truth. And Disneyland Park survived its darkest hour and continued to exist, shining with lights and giving joy to millions of children. But now, its history has a page written in tears and blood, a page that management would prefer to forget, but which society has decided to preserve as a reminder, as a warning, as a promise that something like this will never happen again. Do you believe that the truth always comes out, even after decades of silence?